I really wasn't joking when I said this is my favorite session. I genuinely think this is fundamental to people living a better life, which is why we kind of save it towards the end. But when I'm coaching people one-to-one, this is one of the very first things we talk about. So we do an exercise around identifying core values, which can be quite challenging in itself if it's not something that we've been encouraged to think about earlier in our lives.
Mhm.
And then the gap and the audit, effectively. But the plan around this exercise is to provide a very structured way for people to do this in a short period of time. So it's only 20 minutes. We'll talk through the exercise, but first of all, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what it feels like when we're living a different or a gap between our stated values and what we believe are our core values, and then what we're actually doing day to day, and why this is important. So in theory, our values are our aspirational statements. So they might be our core values. So for example, I would say my core values are things like accountability, courage, honesty, integrity, and then the way in which we're actually practicing those. So very often we can find ourselves working in environments where they don't really fit with our values, or rather our values don't really fit with that. And that can come about in a few ways. So we might be surrounded by other people who don't share the same values. And one of the ways of identifying that is we will find it very, very draining to operate there. So we're either having to keep ourselves quiet or we're consistently experiencing friction because our values don't mesh with theirs. So we either mute our own values and start to simply conform with the environment, and that's very normal and nothing to be ashamed of, or we find we're continually running up against the rest of the pack because our values are coming through and they're not aligned with those. There's a lot of cultural pressure, and as humans, we're designed to effectively conform to the society around us because there's nothing worse as a human than being excluded from the tribe. So, as I said, there is no shame in having to meet our own values, but it can become exhausting. And many of the times when I'm coaching people, and even in my own personal experience when it comes to burnout, the reason for that is this misalignment between who we are fundamentally, which is impossible to change. Our core values are foundational, they're formed at a very young age, and the person that we have to be in order to be successful in an environment if it's the wrong environment for us. So the internal friction inevitably comes out in diminishing performance. We sort of lose our ability to really feel engaged. We very often find ourselves just burning out in terms of energy, enthusiasm, engagement as a whole. But also it can start to show up at home as well. So if we're spending 8 hours minimum a day around people or working for an organization that is misaligned with our core values, it's very hard for that to not filter into everything else. So we can become quite withdrawn. We don't really know who we are anymore. And we certainly find it hard to get excited by the things that used to excite us. So the cost of it overall is fairly significant. And the sooner we can identify whether we've got this friction or not, the better, which is why ideally we have a really good idea of our own core values. And then we use that as a decision-making framework going forward when we're looking at new opportunities, new projects, new people to work with, that kind of thing. I'll pause there briefly. Any questions or any challenges on what I've said so far in terms of people's experience?
Liz, just from me, an observation. And sorry, I mean, I was jesting earlier on about last week. This for me is absolutely critical and key. What's really interesting, though, is when you find stated values of one's own, stated values of an organization. I have a friend who was very vocal about wanting to ensure in a new job that she was going to somewhere where the values of the organization fit with her values. And based on the stated values of said organization, she started working for the organization, only to find that the culture in the organization was not what she expected. Because, of course, the behaviors that were surrounding her in the organization were not matching those that the values actually stated. So that being cognizant of not just one's own values, stated values and behaviors, but also being aware of what's happening around one is really important as well. So it's fascinating, fascinating
Yeah.
stuff.
Now, I couldn't agree more violently, Sinead, on this one.
Mm.
And I've actually spoken to a couple of people, even on this call, in terms of the interview processes. And that's why I think it's super important that we treat, certainly at a senior level, interviews are as much for us to work out whether the culture is aligned with the stated values, so what's written on the wall, as anything else, and whether that's the right cultural fit. So the more interviews we can have with as many people as possible, the better we can sense out whether what is actually incentivized, because that's what behaviors are a result of, what's incentivized. So we can have a perfect thing like PowerPoint on what our values are, but if we're incentivizing different behaviors, we will get different behaviors, and the people that will thrive will not be aligned with the values. They'll be aligned with the incentive framework. That's just how it works. And I may sound quite cynical, having come from financial services, but at the end of the day, if you hire smart people, they're going to work out the system and they're going to game the system. So the ones that succeed are the ones who have the values aligned with the system, as opposed to what looks really nice on a PowerPoint deck or an investor briefing.
You're here.
That's interesting. I can, what I would say, Liz, is that I think I don't think I've ever come across or worked with an organisation at any scale that really does manage to um, translate whatever it might say its stated values are. Now, that's not to say that it never ever does, but in my experience, it's about where is the larger proportion of it, because there's always so much in the cut and thrust of um, activity that makes it very difficult to do unless you have a lot of control, and that generally means in business a lot of money. So unless you're there, then actually that's quite difficult, and I think for me, I find it really difficult to. It's interesting actually, as you know, I have a design background, so I have probably a particular take on it at one level, but I actually think it's difficult to state values. I think that's really difficult to do, and partly because they shift as well from time, or they mutate from time to time. Um, and so what I tend to have, I'm a bit like a homing pigeon, I think. I would find it really difficult to really be clear and say this is what they are, because I'm not sure that would at any one moment would be the right form of expression for it. But I do have a sense for where it is, which of course I do have a sense for where it is, and I do pursue it. And that would be the value, but I actually think it's quite difficult to communicate it, to state it and communicate it actually. Now it might just be just me. Maybe I'm a grey-haired old bloke who's just kind of lost the plot. But do you know what I mean? It's actually a real challenge, I think, and this may be what this exercise is partly about, of course, but about just how do you create that, and actually at any one moment is it inevitably temporary? Now it may be temporary but deep. Do you know what I mean? Because in a sense you're always finding a better form of expression, or you're always finding other layers to it, or you're always finding things that you kind of hadn't thought of at the time you did it. And I think, and now I might be totally wrong about that because it might be so deep, of course, and this is why I guess what you're getting at. It's so deep that actually, even if you don't recognize it, which is someone like me, well, I find it really hard to recognize it. It nonetheless still sits there. But that, and so I find that is fascinating because I think it's actually, for me at least, very difficult to do, actually.
So I think there's a big difference between our personal core values and organizational core values. And we probably need to define the two separately.
Right.
So
Mm.
our personal core values are formed at a fairly young age, and they're very much influenced by the people around us and the environment around us. And once they're formed, they're almost impossible to change. So to your point, they're very, very deep
Right.
and they are welded into our subconscious. So unless we actually sit down, and you like me are British, we were never encouraged to do this growing up.
No,
So
not
the
at
first time
all.
I did this exercise was 12 years ago, and I found it very
Yeah.
um, shocking, but also striking for me as well. So I will send round an exercise where it's effectively like a sheet of 100 different core values, and they all seem great. We all want them, but you start to pick out the ones that really resonate and then bring them down to 3 to 5.
Okay.
And those are typically the values that we have embedded within ourselves. So, and they can be of two different types. So you can have instrumental core values, which is kind of the way in which I do things, or you can have terminal core values, which is what I'm working towards. So financial stability, for example, is a terminal core
Yeah.
value, and accountability is an instrumental core value. And there are no wrong answers, but they're very, very unique. So it's incredibly rare to find two people with exactly the same core values. I'm one of 4 children. My
Yeah.
siblings and I would wager, do not have the same core values, even though we grew up in the same environment, because you all have a different
Right.
experience of that environment, right? So
Mm. Mm.
that combined then with our different strengths and then combined with our passion really forms as a whole kind of what we're here to do. It's very, very unique. So that's our purpose. But the core values piece, as much as people might want to change their core value because on the list everything looks amazing and shiny and you might get jealous of someone else's core values, that's kind of fundamentally set for us. What does change can be our behaviors, the way in which we achieve them, our perspectives, our ambitions. Because, of course, to your point, we adapt and evolve. But those
Yeah.
underlying core values and the way we can often find them, even if we struggle to sort of look inside and go, I'm not sure what mine are, two ways. One, role models. So if you look at people that you really admire and try and distill down what it is you admire about them, there's a good chance that's aligned with your core values.
Mm.
And two, much easier for most people that really rub you up the wrong way and working out what it is, like that
Yeah.
friction can be a really good indicator of what our core value is. Because whatever's being offended, that's something core for us. Because otherwise we'd just let it wash over us, right? But
Yeah.
the instance or the person doesn't have to be an individual, but the thing that's really bugging us. And very often when people are burning out at work, that's the issue. Is effectively they're working towards and they're helping an organization work towards something that rubs them really the wrong way on core values.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
certainly my
Interesting.
personal experience the first time I burnt out,
Mm.
where you can be very, very good at something, but if it's not aligned with what you want to be doing with your life, it's very hard to
Mm.
keep doing it for a long period of time.
Absolutely. Yeah. 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 Oh, yeah. I'm glad it's not that. It's not necessarily an easy thing because I think because I can see that would be quite difficult to do, and it's fascinating actually. Because you're
Mm.
right, Liz. We weren't, even certainly in my generation, there was no conversation about that whatsoever. And if you were either flexible and adaptable or rather rigid and misplaced, and and I was inevitably flexible and adaptable, as you can probably imagine from my shirt. You know, but actually,
Mm.
it's fascinating.
Yeah. No, I mean,
I won't.
growing up in Britain, we weren't encouraged to look inside at all. But if you think you're
No,
at a disadvantage, imagine being in Korea, because when we rolled this exercise out across 64 different countries, Korea and Japan had the hardest time with it because
did
looking
they?
inside
Mm.
is never encouraged, right? So
Yeah,
you grow up in a society where the whole is the priority, not the individual.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, it's fascinating to see how this varies person to person and
Mm.
culture to culture. All right, so the whole point of this exercise is to draw effectively a line between our stated values, what we think we stand for, and then what we're actually doing with our time. And the reason we look at doing this as an audit of the last month is realistically what we're prioritizing or what we're allowing to be prioritized with our time is possibly a lived value. So that's what we're actually applying our time and our energy, which are the only commodities we really have any control over in our lives. This is us doing an honest assessment of, I say something's super important to me, but does my diary reflect whether this is really important to me, or am I living alternative values or someone else's values right now? And the whole purpose of doing this, as always, is not to beat ourselves up, but it's just to give us some data around our own behavior patterns. So if we can see this recurring time and time again, where we're putting our attention, where we're putting our focus and our energy, tells us a lot more about what we aspire to be doing. And if there's a gap there, then as always, then we can put an action plan in place to close that gap. Or maybe we need to review the aspirational stated values and just be a bit more honest with ourselves as well. So closing that gap as much as possible and over time, and it will be an overtime process, aligning our calendar with the values that we really want to be living is one of the most energizing and empowering things we can be doing, which is why I'm so passionate about this whole topic and whole subject. But it is something that will take time. We can't just suddenly go, right, I'm not going to do any of that stuff that I used to do, because we all obviously have to pay the bills and have other people relying on us and everything else, and just go and focus on what I want to do. But over time, whether it's through things like role crafting, whether it's through things like, retraining, whether it's through things like side hustles, whether it's through simply just drawing better boundaries with work, we can start to bring the way in which we're spending our time more in alignment with our values. And again, this will differ for all of us in terms of what we want to do. The first exercise is just 10 minutes. So first of all, we just start with one core value. So identifying that, then auditing our calendar and reviewing the last month of what we were doing, and then just simply documenting, no judgment, but just what, when, and the choice we were making, any gap between what we said that we mattered to us and what we were actually spending our time doing. So here I've given an example of family presence. It's an easy one to pick up. The calendar shows consistently we're actually not present for our families. So whether we're on our phones at the table, whether we're doing evening meetings, whether we're away or working at weekends. But if we're saying actually family is a core value for me, then our behavior and our stated value is somewhat divergent. So we need to think about, well, is that something we can control? And if so, how? And if it's not, how can we counter that with something else? Or how can we bring family up in a way that doesn't require as much time or energy, but make sure that we're still honoring that value? Because every time, if something genuinely is a core value, anytime we're not honoring it, we're kind of breaking trust with ourselves. And that's where the discontent and the burnout comes from, because it means that we're not really living the way that we want to be living. And we can't hide that from our subconscious. We can feel that viscerally. So it starts to show up in, every metric, our biology, our physiology, everything else. The next part of the exercise, so that's 10 minutes. The next 10 minutes is really about the ambition audit, because very often what will happen is someone will go, okay, so family is a key priority for me, but I can't do that. I have to do the evening work and I have to do the weekend work because of my ambition, and my ambition is X. So then we take a look at the ambition just to see, and again, this is zero judgment, but whose definition of success is that you are pursuing? Because if the core values are genuinely the core values, but they're not aligned with what you have to do to achieve that ambition, we need to think about either, is that the correct ambition, or do you need to update that, or do you need to update the core values? And there's a lot of friction in this process, because it can identify some areas where we're kind of lying to ourselves one way or the other. And that's very, very common, and that's absolutely fine. But when stuff starts to get emotional on this, that's the stuff that you should be focusing on. That's the stuff that needs attention, because that's the stuff where actually there's a breaking point and we're not being entirely honest with ourselves. So the definition of success and what we're pursuing, when it comes to our ambition, our authentic is the stuff that comes from what we really want. So if we authentically have an ambition to spend more time with family, for example, then a definition of success is a lifestyle in which we can actually do that. An inherited ambition is something that is very common when we get sucked into a particular career path or industry, and we will effectively inherit that from the people around us. And let's not forget how much that influences our behavior. So if you're in a group of people for 8 hours a day who all have this shared goal, shared ambition, and this is why whenever we reach a goal, if we're in an environment like that, it's never quite enough because someone else has got something more or something more or something more. Whether it's something like that, or very commonly, particularly in certain societies, it might be family or societal expectations. So parents who wanted you to be a doctor or an accountant or a lawyer, that's an inherited ambition. Or societal expectations of just what good success looks like. So the car, the handbag, the outfit, the hairstyle, whatever it may be. But that inherited ambition of what does made it look like? What does good status look like? And the big risk about this one is if they are genuinely divergent and your actual authentic ambition is very different to the inherited ambition, is you might be very, very good at what you do, but you're going to get to your 40s, your 50s, your 60s and realize that you've been climbing a ladder against someone else's wall. So it's not going to have fulfilled you. And then you're maybe halfway there and you've only got half your life to then fulfill your own ambitions. Now, that may be okay, but it needs to be an eyes wide open decision to make, particularly if, then there may well be dependencies. I've got, family to support, mortgage to pay, everything else. That's absolutely fine. But then we need to find new ways of being able to honor your values and weave them into what you're doing, as opposed to it just being completely divergent. On this one, again, just 10 minutes. The first one, identify your current goal. This might be hitting my revenue targets for the year. It might be getting my promotion. It might be anything you want to put here around the way in which you are spending your time and investing your time in your day. So identifying your current goal. Then the second part is tracing its origins. So where did that goal come from? Has that come from my boss? Has that come from home? Has that come from my parents? Or has it come from me? It may well be that actually this is my goal. I want to prove this. I want to do this. And step number 3, if there is a gap, if it's not yours specifically, and it's driven from someone else, from an inherited ambition, then is there a way that you can reimagine that goal on your own terms? So I'm not saying abandon the goal, but is there a way in which it can be used to fulfill your own ambitions as opposed to someone else's? So as I said, there is no wrong answer here and there is zero judgment here, but you do need to identify whose definition of success you're operating under. And then once you've done that, you need to make a decision on whether you want to continue, which is completely valid, or redefine it in a way in which it actually serves your own authentic ambitions. The first one, set a timer. So only do this for 20 minutes because you could go down a massive rabbit hole on this one. And we're not looking for an existential crisis. We're just looking for 20 minutes dedicated to working without interruption, not editing anything. So not worrying about whether someone else will read this. So just raw, honest answers. And then noticing those emotions. Because as I said, when the emotions are coming up, those are very valuable data points. That's going to be where you find the magic on this one. So that's where you really need to be focusing. Always goals on this one. So once you've identified any gaps, and this is assuming that there are, I've yet to meet anyone who has had no gaps. Once you've identified a gap that you want to work on, just prioritize one thing. So one change and make it small as always. So ideally laughably small, but something small that means that you can start to close that gap between your own ambitions and the ones that you are following, or your own values and the way in which your calendar is mapping out. So redesign that calendar and translate your values into how you're dedicating your time. And if it matters, make sure that you are prioritizing it. Because we always say we don't have enough time. And one of the best things my very first coach taught me was it's not that you don't have enough time, it's that you're just not prioritizing something. We always find time for our priorities. We do. So make sure that you're prioritizing your values in your calendar. And then finally, one of the hardest things to do, communicate your boundaries. So if you're going to start honoring your values and what you want to be doing, but it means you are disappointing others, there is going to be some noise about this. So you're going to need to state those boundaries and you're going to need to repeatedly reinforce those boundaries. Because at the end of the day, people's demands of you and your time are never going to stop coming. So you have a choice on whether you want to protect that and live your values or you want to give it over to someone else. And again, totally up to you, but just make sure you're doing that consciously rather than letting 40 years slip by and just realizing you've done it far, far too late. As I said at the beginning, this is going to be a repeat exercise. This is not a one and done. So I would recommend every month setting aside this 20 minutes, make a nice cup of tea or coffee, whatever it may be, sit down and do the exercise so that you can stop yourself from drifting, because it's really easy to drift back into old habits, as we know. Ideally, if you can find an accountability partner, so this might be a partner at home, this might be someone even at work, it might be anyone, any friend who can actually, really pull you up and hold you accountable to this one. And then just remember that time is your most finite resource. So I said time and energy, they're the only two things we can really control in terms of where we put them, where we give them in life. So when it comes to dedicating them to your authentic priorities, there really isn't anything you can do better for everyone around you than do stuff that's aligned with your values and your authentic ambition. Because when you come across someone who is doing that, you will notice that there is a very big difference in their energy levels and the contagion around their enthusiasm versus someone who is just going through the motions. So if you're working on something, you may be technically exceptionally good at something, but if it's not aligned with your core values and it's not aligned with your ambition, you're only going to get so far. But the people that you meet that are genuinely exceptional leaders are the ones who are really aligned, and there's just no limit on what they can achieve and the people around them that they can achieve as well. So that's my part. I'm going to stop recording now so that we can have an open conversation.